All right, hello. I'm Peter Morville, and I am delighted that I get to speak with you about the magic of search. I'm going to keep my talk short to allow some time for questions, so make sure you have some. Let's start with a story. We are several hundred feet into the cave when Claudia whispers in the dark, "I'm so mad at you for bringing us here." I'm not surprised. It's my fault. I planned this vacation. I chose to bring my wife and our teenage daughters on this expedition to Aktun Tunichil Muknal, a subterranean cave in Belize that contains the sparkling calcified skeletons of children. Over 1,000 years ago, the Maya believed the cave of the crystal sepulcher, with its demons, scorpions, and rivers of blood, to be an entrance to hell and a fit place for ritual human sacrifice. The Maya had a point. After hiking through rainforest in the rain for an hour, swimming an icy stream into the cave mouth, and scrambling over slippery rocks with only headlamps for light, we are cold, tired, fearful. A man sits in the shadows, his face darkened by blood. He must have fallen. That's why our daughter is angry. It's treacherous, and our 3-hour tour of the underworld has just begun. I'm excited by the wonders of this cave, but I'm also aware of the danger. Since I'm the one who instigated this adventure, I imagine my family may leave me here, a human sacrifice given readily to appease the gods. I knew the risks when I planned this holiday. In fact, risk was one of the goals. I asked Susan and the girls what they wanted. We explored options and reflected on past trips. Our teenagers did not want to sit on a beach. They were eager for adventure. So we devised an itinerary to include swimming with sharks, ziplining the jungle, and hiking in caves. I researched hotels, restaurants, transport, things to do. I booked flights, made checklists, and checked passports. I built flexibility into the schedule to allow for weather and mood. I did all of this happily, knowing full well that something would go wrong. I tell this story in my book, Planning for Everything, but it could just as easily be in a book about search. This trip would not have happened without Google. All the research and planning and booking was done via the internet. And despite the risks, nothing went wrong. We had an amazing family adventure, and the highlight was the cave. This once-in-a-lifetime journey into the underworld was enabled by the magic of search. My interest in search dates back to the early 1990s when I went to library school at the University of Michigan, and I fell in love with the internet. I was inspired by the possibility of creating a global digital library, free, searchable, accessible to all. And I had a dream. I wanted to organize information so that people could find what they need. And that's precisely what I've done. Over the last 25 years, I've helped all sorts of organizations with their information architecture and user experience challenges. Along the way, I've written a number of animal books about information architecture, findability, search, systems thinking, and planning. Implicit in all these books is the idea of change and the hope that with greater understanding, we can make better websites, better systems, and better plans. Looking back of all the books I've written, it was the polar bear that made the biggest splash. It helped to define the discipline of information architecture, and to this day shapes how we practice user experience. In the book, we define information architecture as the structural design of shared information environments and as the synthesis of organization, labeling, search, and navigation systems. In short, we are architects of places made of information. I created the user experience honeycomb in 2004 to help people to go beyond usability. Because while ease of use does matter, it's also vital to be useful, desirable, findable, accessible, and credible. And the right balance depends on the product or service in question. Of course, the most important insight of user experience is the simplest. Don't blame the user. Sadly, it's a lesson many folks have failed to learn. This cartoon features a real quote from an executive. Most of the complaints we get are due to the way users search. They use the wrong keywords. Yeah, right, it's those stupid users. Now, those of us at this event, we know search is not magic. From software engineering to architecture and design, it's hard, messy work. But if we do our jobs well, then to the user, it feels like magic. And instead of making someone feel dumb, we make them feel smart. That's a pretty cool trick in itself. My approach to information architecture was shaped by pioneering research in information-seeking behavior. Way back in 1989, Marcia Bates showed that information seeking is iterative and interactive. We enter a few keywords, discover something that's not quite right, try a different query, and around we go. Search involves feedback and learning. What we find changes what we see. So at its best, search is a complex adaptive system. It's not just about the interface or the software. We must also study users and understand their goals and context. And we should analyze content and remove the rot, content that's redundant, outdated, or trivial. Because the fastest way to improve an information retrieval system is to reduce the volume of content. And we must include content creators in our vision of search. Are we giving them the tools and processes and incentives they need to create better content and metadata? Are we closing the feedback loop so that search is better over time? Do we understand the design principles behind a good search experience? Are we accommodating the most common patterns of behavior? Are we integrating search with complementary modes of information seeking? It helps to zoom in on search, but we must also zoom out to see the big picture. Because in addition to search, users also ask and browse and filter. A good information architecture supports multiple paths and modes. When I worked with Cisco about 10 years ago, I was hired to improve search. They were embarrassed. Their customers mostly used Google instead of site search on cisco.com to find their content. One of the first things they told me was that faceted navigation doesn't work in the enterprise context. According to their analytics, very few users interacted with their filters. But data can be dangerous. Quantitative without qualitative can lead to the wrong conclusions. In fact, when I talked with their users, I learned that they would like to use filters if they were better designed. For instance, there were more than 100 document types. People had no idea which one to select. So to improve search, Cisco needed better metadata. And that's not all. There was so much work to be done to improve the information architecture. And that's not all. Improvements to content and information architecture weren't going to happen without better governance and metrics and incentives. Search was simply the visible tip of a massive iceberg. This was not the message my client wanted to hear, but it was the truth. Last year, I worked with a client who manages a massive database of federal and state tax regulations. It was a 10-week project with a background review, heuristic evaluation, stakeholder interviews, user research, and a roadmap workshop. During the user research, it was fascinating to witness the extent to which their customers had tunnel vision. They paid attention to individual search results and were blind to most of the features. And let me tell you, there were a lot of features. So many, in fact, that users were totally overwhelmed and ignored them all. As Dan Ward explains in The Simplicity Cycle, this overwhelming complexity is all too common. You see, when an organization first creates a product, all the features are good, but the customers still have unmet needs. So the team adds features, and the customers are happy, and the team is praised and rewarded. And this virtuous cycle continues until it breaks. An inflection point is reached beyond which the product is too complex, and each new feature makes things worse. To make the product better, we must now make it simpler, which is a governance challenge because removing features goes against organizational metrics and habits. Often, to fix search, we must change the culture. And that is really hard. A couple of years back, I worked with a financial services company on a database to support thousands of mortgage bankers. The CEO wanted the system to work like Alexa. He wanted bankers to ask questions, not enter queries. And he wanted to deliver answers, not documents. Now, I was 99% sure this was the wrong approach, and I said so, but still they wanted to proceed. So we did, and it was fun because we got to design a pretty cool system that wasn't faceted search. It reminded me of an insight from one of my professors at library school. She told us to embrace our constraints. And I do. The older I get, the more I find it's the constraints that make life interesting. Speaking of challenges, I'm currently working with the legal department of an international nonprofit. Their intranet is the most fragmented information environment I've ever seen. Attorneys and legal associates struggle to share and find content across platforms and locations. Most information is invisible to most people due to restrictive permissions and the complete absence of search. If you want a document, you must know it exists and you must know who to ask. It's a knowledge management nightmare reminiscent of the Tower of Babel. This is an organization desperately in need of the magic of search. Sometimes I feel we've lost the magic. There was a time, not so long ago, when search was subject to all sorts of creative experiments. For instance, ambient devices invented orbs and umbrellas that tracked the weather, stock market activity, sports scores, and energy usage. And entrepreneurs used LEDs and RFIDs to transform wine racks into faceted navigation systems. To be fair, there is good work being done today. For instance, in the past year or so, I've had to buy a lot of furniture, and the process has been made so much better by Wayfair. From faceted search to delivery to assembly instructions, they offer a great customer experience. And in particular, when I'm searching for something, I'm often impressed that they have just the right filter. And there are promising developments in voice search with visual feedback. And of course, Find My on the iPhone is pretty amazing. To precisely locate friends and family at any point in time, well, that is clearly magic. But we mustn't stop inventing. As this tweet about our baby chicks and the band formerly known as the Dixie Chicks illustrates, the ambiguity of language places limits on query parsing and text analysis. So we must experiment with complementary signals of user intent, such as location, date, time, recent trends, and behavior. That's why this conference and this community are so important. Search relevance is not a solved problem. And we mustn't stop imagining. In search, there is infinite possibility. Can we help people to find something that feels or tastes or looks or sounds or smells like this? Search led our family into a mystical cave in Belize. And search brought all of us here today. As I wrote in my book, Ambient Findability, what we find changes who we become. Search demands attention to detail, but it's vital from time to time to take a step back and see the bigger picture. We must not lose our sense of wonder. Search is a powerful lever, an agent of change, an instigator of personal and societal transformation. Search changes how we plan, where we go, who we trust, and what we believe. And of course, what we find changes who we become. That's what this conference and this community are all about. Welcome to the magic of search. And that's all, folks. Thanks for your attention. As I warned you, I left plenty of time for questions. So hopefully folks in the room or online will have some questions for me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Peter. That was wonderful and inspirational, and I think set the scene for the whole day. So thank you for that. So we're going to now ask for some questions. And I think because we have an in-person speaker, we should first off see if we have any speakers in the room. Now, we only have one wireless microphone, and I think Peter is using it. So we may have to do some microphone shuffling, or you could ask via the chat perhaps. But all of you also listening from around the world, please do drop any questions you have in the chat. For Peter, you have an opportunity to question one of the leaders in the field. So please do give us your questions. But let's see, is there anyone in Charlottesville who has a question for Peter?
Looks like Eric's coming out. Oh, here. Yeah, I'll step aside. Oops, just
So I think I'm walking up here to say hi and ask my question. And my question, Peter, is, are you saying that maybe we've gotten too focused on being smart with machine learning and AI, and we're like narrowed down, and where all of our innovations, we maybe have forgotten about user experience? I mean, when we look at the program today, it's a lot about signals and things, and we need to maybe look broader and apply those techniques, not just to the text that we're searching, but more broadly.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So I've always been a little bit more of an advocate of thinking of IA over AI, both from the perspective, obviously, of information architecture, but also Doug Engelbart's concept of intelligence augmentation, another kind of IA, using computers to make us smarter rather than hoping that they get smart. So I've always been a little bit of a skeptic with AI, pretty much since I started work in the field in the 1990s. I've had all sorts of clients who felt that AI was going to change their world next year. And you know, there are, you know, all kinds of really interesting developments in machine learning and things that have really, you know, kind of improved search, for instance, but there's always more hype than reality. So for instance, I was working with one of the organizations I mentioned here, the financial services company. And so at the end of the day, we did design a pretty cool question answering system. It reminded me of when I was a kid and I used to read Which Way books, right? So you sort of come up with a question, and then the computer would ask you more questions, you know, follow-up question. Are you looking for this or this? And you answer that. And basically, you know, through this sort of branching tree structure, you would get down to hopefully a specific answer. So we designed a pretty interesting system, but it probably would only deal with about 20% of the questions people actually had, right? It wasn't particularly scalable. So I was right when I said I was 99% sure that CEO was wrong. Like, we put a huge amount of time and effort. It was a lot of fun, but we also had to design a faceted navigation system to provide access to these thousands of documents. And so they decided to use Google Cloud Search as their search tool. And so there was a vendor that was going to help us integrate that. And I had a conference call with them and our clients, and I asked a bunch of hard questions and they couldn't answer any of them. So they got fired. And then we brought in another vendor who was actually much better at sort of, you know, integrating and adapting Google Cloud Search. But the fact of the matter was, like, even someone who was pretty good at this couldn't answer a lot of hard questions, couldn't really, there was so many challenges around getting any straight answer around how machine learning was actually going to help. We realized that if it was going to help in that context, we were going to have to come up with clear, meaningful categories of searcher types, because, you know, within the organization, it really wasn't just a monolithic group of mortgage bankers. There were a bunch of different types of people with different needs and even different languages, not necessarily international languages, but different ways of using words and different meanings for different words. And so just letting machine learning, run across the whole organization wasn't going to be particularly helpful. So we realized we're gonna have to segment all of these users, figure out what the categories are, so that the machine learning is useful for each group. It became more and more complex as we tried to dig into like, how are we gonna actually leverage this? So I wouldn't say I have a ton of experience with, what's the kind of cutting edge of machine learning. But at the same time, as someone who's not particularly technical, but that does know how to ask some of the tough questions about search, I have never seen particularly great examples, right? Like that's what you read a paper and you look at someone's website and things sound really exciting. And what I've learned to do over the years is just always ask, like, show me this working in a real context. And that's where I tend to see things fall down. So I guess I know there's some positive things happening with AI and machine learning. I still see in my day-to-day work and the kinds of search experiences that our customers are creating and need to create, that a lot of it is not new. It's stuff we've known for the last 20 years, but it's really hard to make it work, right? Just something is, one of the problems I've run into with clients in internal environments, right, intranets or sort of internal, we now have a proliferation of platforms where people have things on local servers and Box and Microsoft Teams and SharePoint and, all sorts of platforms, right? I don't know of a search tool that can search across all those platforms, right? And so, different organizations have different responses to that. Do we reduce our number of platforms down to one so we can at least search this stuff? Do we go on a quest for the holy grail, finding a cross-platform search tool that can help us? Do we find some messy place in the middle of that, right? So, I think in e-commerce, I've seen search get a lot better since I started this work back in the 90s. In internal environments, not so much. It's still a real challenge. But I think that keeping a focus on the end user, on the experience that they're having, and being creative about how do we solve their problems, how do we make things better for them, being really insistent on things like speed, right? Like on some of these servers, the nonprofit I'm working with right now, it literally takes 3 minutes to run a search. I've never seen anything like it. It's insane. And they will start a search and go get a cup of coffee and come back and see what the results are, right? Like it's astonishing. And so while it's, I think we have to keep in mind the full spectrum. There are, on the one hand, we want to know what's going on at the cutting edge or the bleeding edge of search, right? Like what are the really cool new things that are coming, that are happening? How can we be involved in that? And at the same time, we have to remind ourselves and our clients and colleagues that there are lots of environments out there that are still in the dark, that are still untouched by the magic of search at all, that are unsearchable. And doing the sort of missionary work to kind of help bring search into an unsearched place can make a tremendous difference for folks. I guess I'll just kind of wrap up this very long answer, and we'll see what other questions there are. But when I work with organizations these days around search, I would say there's two big categories of problems, two big blockers. Number one is politics and governance and just kind of figuring out how to align incentives and teams to actually get the work done, right? To sort of actually get the organization to invest in search. And the other is for lack of a better word, integration. It's having people who really know how to make search do what it should. And that's why I think this conference and this community are exciting, because a lot of you folks do. But I am in all sorts of environments where you're trying to get IT to do this, and it's like pulling teeth, right? Like, oh, we can't change how things are ranked. Or you're working with an integration vendor that doesn't really have a lot of familiarity with the tool. And so from an information architecture and user experience perspective, often even when we know what would create a better experience, we can't get it done. So we need you folks to help us with that. So other questions? Yes.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to turn to some questions from the Zoom here. So I'm trying to pick one that you haven't just covered in your answer there, because you covered a lot. So let's have a look. Okay, so Raphael asks, in your consulting experience, is it common that organizations have wildly disparate assumptions on how to resolve their information problems? And how do you give them the necessary steps back for them to analyze the problem?
Yeah, good question. I have touched on that because, like, right, the example that comes to mind right away is this financial services company. That was an interesting one because the CEO had very strong opinions on what kind of experience he wanted to deliver, and kind of viewed himself as a bit of a visionary, right? We had this very odd experience where we go into his corner office, and he demonstrated Alexa for us. And we're like, so he said, watch this. And he said, Alexa, I think he asked something about how long do koala bears live? And then Alexa told him, and he's like, I want it to be like that. And so, and this was an environment where it was the people who worked for him didn't want to push back, right? And so, like, even though I'm generally happy to push back on things, I had to kind of work with our clients who worked for him, and so we had to navigate in a very uneasy kind of middle course, because I will always do my best to be honest and to tell the truth and to sort of speak truth to power in these consulting situations. But I also know that, if you want to affect change, you have to be gentle, right? You can't just upset people and alienate people. So I try to strike a middle ground of sort of talking through what course of action I would recommend given the people and the technology that are in place, given the culture and the workflow that is realistic, has a realistic chance of success. So in that case, it didn't take long for me to convince a decent number of folks in the organization that we were probably going to need that faceted search as a backup plan. And so they ended up having two entire work streams. One was a team of folks that were developing this question answering system, and another set of folks that were kind of working with us on what metadata we needed to apply to documents, and how to apply that in the content management system in order to enable faceted search. And we're designing the interface. And I don't think anyone had the guts early on to tell the CEO that this other plan was being put into place. But later on, he sort of came around and he was okay. I think he ended up sort of having the perspective that he was never against having two different ways. He just didn't want us to take the most common, easy way out first, I guess. But in any case, I think that, I run up against all sorts of preconceived notions about what kind of solution is gonna kind of help. I get into arguments. Like, I had an argument with, I worked with this e-commerce company that was bought by Walmart for like $1 billion. Probably some of you might be able to guess what that was. They had a horrible search experience. Their faceted navigation was like 10 years behind Amazon, which I told them. And their chief technology officer just started arguing in public. It was pretty awkward, pretty uncomfortable. But he says, we don't want to catch up to Amazon. We want to leapfrog them and deliver a voice search experience like like you can have with Alexa. And I was like, have you tried shopping with Alexa? Like even that more modern, at that point in time, you didn't have the visual feedback. But even with the visual feedback, it's so much easier to search on your iPhone or your laptop than to try shopping and searching using your voice, right? I mean, there's folks with disabilities who can't do that. And so this, that's a life changer for them. But for me, there's no way I'm gonna waste my time trying to shop via voice. So, I had to make my case, and I'm not, in that particular one, I'm not sure I won. But I think we're all gonna confront situations where we feel like someone wants to head in the wrong direction. And, it really first of all, this is all on a case-by-case basis, right? Like, what are the risks of fighting the direction we're heading? To me personally, to the organization, is this important enough that I'm gonna take that risk? As a consultant, it's a little less, I don't mind getting fired so much, right? If you're an employee, it's a tougher thing to sort of fight. I guess one last thing on this is that over the years, I've found it's one thing that really surprises me sometimes is that when people say, we got to do it this way. And you think, okay, they've thought this through, they know the same things I do, and for whatever reason, they've come down in this direction. And I've had these just like really surprising moments where we've started just talking about like, well, tell me a little bit more about why, right? Explain to me why you think we need to do that. And you get down to some assumption, a couple of levels down, that's completely wrong. Like that it has to be this or this, or right. And you're able to kind of get rid of that confrontational posture completely because there was some mistake in how they were viewing things that once you address that, they're completely on board. So even when folks have a different way of thinking things have to happen, sometimes just having a good conversation and sort of asking the why question and getting down a little deeper can be helpful.
I think we all aspire, certainly those of us who are search consultants, to be able to speak truth to power. And that's a nice position to be in. I've got another question here from Mary D. Hi, Mary D. Who asks, do you think the patterns of iterative search and feedback loops as identified by Marcia Bates have changed over time, given the developments in the overall search environment? Are user expectations different, for example?
That's a great question. I've never really thought about that in that way, but I'm sure it's kind of a yes and no answer, right? On the one hand, the most obvious answer is yes, because back when she was doing that research, the information retrieval tools were so vastly different, so much more basic. Now that every teenager has an iPhone in their pocket and they're used to being able to look up any fact in the universe in sort of 1.2 seconds or whatever, clearly the way that we interact with information has changed drastically, and our expectations of what we should be able to find and how quickly have changed drastically. And things like faceted search that, pretty much nobody, some tiny percentage of humanity had ever used a faceted search interface before like the year 1998 or something. And now that's how people shop, right? We have all collectively learned a lot about search and how to make it work for us. On the flip side, Marcia Bates has done some interesting work, kind of, I mean, her entire kind of body of work around information seeking behavior, kind of harkens back to like the fact that we evolved from hunter-gatherers and our brains have a certain kind of wiring, and that, not so long ago, our searching was the search for food, right? Where, the whole berry picking model with her information seeking behavior, our most famous paper was around the sort of the berry picking model of information seeking, and the idea that we're kind of moving around and looking for things, and if we find something good, we go a little deeper, right? We're like, oh, there's some good berries. I bet there's more right around here. And so she sort of, extended, she kind of made a connection between how hunter-gatherers searched for food and how we search for information online. And the wiring of our brains hasn't changed all that much, right? It has changed, right? If you think about, there's research that shows how people have a harder time paying attention. It's harder to read a book now because of all our exposure to social media and the sort of instant gratification of Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and so forth. So we are changing the wiring of our brains a little, but if you sort of think about, at a core level, how we search, I think that, we're still hunter-gatherers at heart. Did you still have a question?
I think nothing I've done. My question was about the simplicity versus complexity on attribution. But you praised the facet search on the search engine. But on the other hand, Google doesn't run facets, right?
Yeah.
It's very vanilla. And that's, I think, the complexity in the backend is still very much needed in order to simplify the user experience.
Yeah.
So, do you think, like, if very clear is remove all the complexity you might see and remove those facets and filters, would that make a better experience, a better search experience?
Yeah, and I'll repeat that for the folks online.
And you've got a few minutes.
Okay. So yeah, so we're sort of getting at here is, the relationship between simplicity and complexity, kind of looking at Google as really bringing simplicity to the user, and we'll just use Amazon for as an example of more complex where you've got faceted navigation. And a lot of times I have to deal with this with clients because they will say, we just want to be like Google. And my take on it is, that, and first of all, Google does have filters, right? There are ways that you can say, just show me images or just show me videos, or right. So it's not faceted navigation, but it's filters. And what it's enabling is what faceted navigation does really well, which is conversational search, right? Where, starting with a query with a word or two is a really efficient way to get started. But because of the ambiguity of language and because you've only got a couple of words, you're not going to get tremendous precision right off the bat unless you're lucky. And so facets enable essentially the system to say, tell me a little more about what you're looking for. And in an environment like e-commerce, where you have the ability to have structured metadata applied consistently across products and categories and so forth, you've got the ability to enable this really good rhythmic conversational search experience where you can kind of narrow down to what you're looking for. And I think that has tremendous value. Google can't do that, right? It's the diversity of stuff that's being searched really doesn't lend itself towards that kind of, the sort of structured, faceted experience that a Wayfair.com can deliver in the furniture kind of domain. So I don't think that I wouldn't argue that simplicity is always better than complexity. I just think there is a complexity threshold that you go over. Too many facets, too many filters, where it gets overwhelming. So the challenge of designing facet navigation is to figure out which facets, which values, how do we present them in a way that's not overwhelming so that people can take that simple next step after their query and say, oh yeah, I need a round table, not a square one, right? It needs to be this height, not this height. And so that's what I love about facet navigation in search is it enables a conversational mode, an iterative, interactive way of information seeking. And I have a feeling we're just about out of time.